Last night we spent our time investigating the reality of mortality, the creatureliness and the limitations of being an embodied being. The rest of the weekend we're dealing with the eternal. And there's a paradox here. Of course, I said yesterday that it's all paradox. Why is it that as in my dying, deteriorating body, there are immortal longings? There's a longing for life and for more as I deplete. It's not like my desire for life lessens, it actually increases. That's the paradox. As I diminish, my desire for life increases. And that's not only the continuation of this life, but the sense that there is that more that we talked about last night with the capital M. So when we talk about the eternal, we're not just talking about the afterlife. We're talking about the experience of the eternal in the now. That is, another way of expressing what the eternal means is the experience of God in the here and now. We feel the breath of God, the experience of God in the here and now. And I'm going to do some introductory remarks here on this whole nature of what we mean by the eternal. The eternal is not later, it's how do I see and experience the eternal in the midst of my limited embodied life. Where is the candle in the darkness? You know, the famous reading about footprints, where do I see the footprints of Christ all around me? Where I know the presence has been there. This is the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis, the lion, the footprints are there. You know that he's been around, and he's not a tameable lion, this is the otherness. We also know, in our poetry, in our particularly love stories and love experiences, there is that sense that, that there's an eternal dimension to something that is very human and very concrete. And that is the encounter with the holy. So how do I incarnate and have the imagination for the future? How do I know that this eternal exists? And I'll just give an example from human experience that I hear all the time. If you have a deep relationship, a soul friend, it could be a spouse, or it could be a friend, it could be a companion of some kind, a person that you have really connected on a very deep soul level, you have these kind of synchronicities. You make a phone call and the person was dialing you at the same time, or you were thinking about them and they texted you saying, I was just thinking about you. There's a way in which relationships, human relationships, are not limited by time and space. There's something whole about connection, soul connections. And you see this in the poetry of Rumi and his friend Shams, that they had such a deep spiritual relationship that their human relationship was a dimension of divine relationship. They knew that there was a divine by the fact that the way they were relating to each other was not merely a human relationship. It wasn't just human intimacy, it was divine intimacy intersected into it. As a spiritual director, I have the privilege of recognizing this very often in a direction session when we're talking, and all of a sudden there's a sense of quiet, silence. There's a moment of someone is present, that we have just opened the door to something beyond us. And in spiritual direction, at least in my view, I always have a candle or an icon of something to remind us that God is present. But there are times in which that presence is palpable. You know that God is here. To be in relationship to the eternal, okay, means that I have to be willing to let go of some of the attachments that keep me too grounded here. And you know what I have encountered recently with a number of directees, especially with older people, is that towards the end of people's lives, one of the most divisive things that happens in families is around money. And I've worked in hospice, care for my, my early training. And it was like, sometimes the space was really holy space that, you were initiating a person into the next world. And other times there was fights about the will over the dying body that you had to pull people out of the room and say, please handle this someplace else. They can hear this, But the money complex is the attachment to the security of this world. And it disregards the eternal. The old expression, you can't bring it with you, is literally true. And for all of your attachments, unless you have a living relationship to the eternal, you can, to your dying breath, hang on to this money complex or these other addictions that stop us from experiencing God in the widest vision. Sumong Kid, in one of her spiritual books, calls the unholy trinity. And the unholy trinity is perfection, pleasing, and performance. Perfection, pleasing, and performance. And in the face of eternity, what do any one of these things mean? Absolutely nothing. I mean, eternity, the experience of God, relativizes all of our obsessive, neurotic need to be judged upon our performance or pleasing someone or having to do it perfectly. Sometimes it is sad that we cannot let go. The process of letting go to the eternal can be very bumpy for some people who have been in denial around the eternal in their life. Once I dealt with a man who was in hospice, and I would say maybe 5 minutes before he died, his last burst of energy was to get on his cell phone and supposedly he wanted to make plane reservations to Florida. Now, he's in hospice, he's got 5 minutes more to live, he's on his last breath. And he uses his last breath to try and make arrangements to go to Florida. And the tragedy is, you're going somewhere, but it's not Florida. You're on a trip of a lifetime. This is not where you think you're going. But if you're not in touch with the eternal in your life, you're not prepared for the transition to the eternal in the afterlife. So too much materialism in our society really believes, and I have a director who's a hospice nurse who says that she is more and more shocked by people in their 90s coming into hospice shocked that they're going to die. They're just not prepared for it because, they did yoga every day and, they only eat non-fat food and they took all the vitamins and they do acupuncture. And I shouldn't be in this position. Well, you are. So society tends to live rejecting the spirit for as long as it can to hold on to our own old securities. And we need to suffer this paradox of deterioration and yet immortal longings. And Ronald Rolhouse's book, Holy Longings, is a good reflection on that our longings for connection and life does not decrease in age. It actually increases in age, but not of this world, but of the promised new world. And this is where, the Celtic spirituality talks about the thin place. If you've never encountered that thin place, then there's this fear of dying. One of my favorite old movies, and if I ever want to get a good laugh, we watched it just a couple of weeks ago. Some of the guys had never seen it. Is Moonstruck. Have you ever seen Moonstruck? Okay. In which Cher is there and Olivia Dukakis. And Olivia Dukakis is the stable wife, and the husband is having I wouldn't even say an affair, like a tryst, with a younger woman. And Olivia, of course, knew what was going on. She said, he's afraid of dying. This is my last chance in the old corral. Is this how fear of dying can cause us to regress, as we said last night, and the acceptance of dying can move us into solidifying our life and living with gratitude. I believe that we're bombarded with messages from God about this eternal dimension, except we've lost contact with it. We're not struck by awe. I'm always amazed, particularly young people who are jogging and doing all this stuff in a beautiful space, and that you can hear the music or whatever it is, 10 feet away, and there's no connection to their environment. There's no sense of awe. They're in their heads while their body is exercising. And the lack of awe is a lack of connection to the eternal. Awe is one of those human qualities that makes us aware that there must be something more. As soon as you have a sense of gratitude, who are you grateful to? When you look at creation, or these days, can you not just feel the beauty of the Creator? Our poverty is mostly in the fact that we are we committed to recognizing the infinite, the eternal in the present? Again, the paradox. The more I know I am finite, the more I will be able to experience the infinite. The more I think I'm the center of reality, the less I get any messages from beyond. So the opportunities that I need to incarnate in an historical moment, this sense of both finite and infinite, and we live with this immortal longings with the practice of our own dying. Now, we know, and we're celebrating beginning tomorrow, we enter into Holy Week, and here is the great, wonderful motif of world religions, which is suffering, death, resurrection. Slavery, liminality, new life. It's all the themes are all repeated. And that the infinite is at work in the finite. That God is present in our presence. It seems that God wants us to make a mark. There's a purpose for our existence. And, that's an existential reality. What has been the purpose of your existence? And that's not about productivity. It's about relationship. Where have you been imprinted in the reign of God, where the reign of God is moving towards? Remember last night we began with a poem by Jessica Powers, and she intimated, right, that we come from the infinite, we're called to incarnate, and we go back to the infinite, conscious of the choices that we have made and that we are in relationship to this divinity. And it seems to be that the purpose of our life is to wake up and to choose our life. To choose life and to choose our mission, our purpose, our direction. That we are born to die and rise. We are born to age and to let go and to return to the infinite, but not as we arrived from the infinite, but in a new and different way. When a child is born, they are intimately connected with divine grace and are in the presence of holiness. You can feel in a child, right? This unity with divinity. But it's not yet conscious. The child is not conscious that it is held in divinity. And all of life is to be able to have the second birth where I choose to be consciously birthed in divinity, where I participate and I choose both suffering, death, and resurrection, where I participate in God's mystery. Recently, I have a directee who has a great deal of knowledge in classical music and is a musician himself, a pianist. And he sent me one of Schubert's musical pieces, and it's called the Litany for All Souls Day. And it's a beautiful, if you ever want to listen to a piece of music that really yearns and names the, sometimes music gets us in touch with the immortal, art, beauty. And he wrote this litany and he says, all the souls who full of clarity become martyrs to truth, struggling for sacred faith, but seeking not the martyr's crown, all who have parted from here, all souls rest in peace. And those who never smiled at the sun, keeping watch on the thorns beneath the moon, to see God in the pure heavenly light, and look him just once in the face, all who have parted from here, all souls rest in peace. And Jung, though not a religious person, because he separated from his father was a minister, there was all kinds of issues there, but he was very aware of the dynamics of the soul, and he said that there is an immediate difference with a person in the aging process if they have a felt sense that there is more after this life.
Say that again.
That there's an intuition among those who know that there is more to this life, the quality of their life, the meaning of their life, and peace in their death is significantly higher than someone who lives in a materialistic world. And that makes sense, right? Because if you are already in tune with this eternal here, the transition into the eternal without the embodied becomes much easier. I worked with a Jesuit in California. His name was Father Tom Han, and he was a very spiritual man who had lived like 30 years in Japan and had become an expert in Buddhist meditation practices and so forth. And he had a very interesting thing about looking towards his death. He had cancer, and he would make people very uncomfortable by his freedom. Like we don't expect people to be that free, but he would say, I'm kind of looking anxious. I've never done this before. It's like, this is like a whole new thing, and I think he was such a person open to experience that there was something new that the eye had never experienced before. Now, the next thing, okay, so this is just the introduction to the eternal. The eternal is a reality. It is here, not just afterlife. Are we attuned to it or not? These are the basic questions. Are you aware of it? Can you sense the breath of God in your neck when you're running away from Him? Can you see the footprints in the sand? Do you notice that 30 seconds of silence that you know something opened up that you can't name it? Those are intimations of the eternal. They're not proofs. They're not scientific proofs. But they are pointing to a reality, yet unlived. Now, we're going to do some things on typology. And the reason why I want to do a few things on typology, and most of you are probably familiar with type, it's Jung's basis of understanding consciousness from an individual basis. He wrote the book on type in 1921, and it's about how we are not living our consciousness in the same way. I don't live my consciousness in the same way as someone else. My type determines the passage of how I live my life and my consciousness. And typology is an orientation to both the inner world and the outer world. And there are those who are orientated more naturally inward, and there are those that are more naturally outward. And the goal is not to become more of who you are, but to create a balance. So if you're an introvert, the goal is not to become the extraordinary introvert, it's to integrate extroverted energy so that you become more balanced. So that, it's never a defense position. When somebody says, oh, I'm an introvert, which means I can't deal with this, that's an excuse. Or an extrovert says, this is too much, I can't take 5 minutes of silence, whatever it might be. Those are excuses. The real invitation is we create a more balanced life. The longer we live, we try and make a more balanced life. Okay. Because we have a richer experience of life if I can include things that I'm not naturally gifted in. And also the fourth piece here that's in the handouts is there is a physiological basis to this also. It's not that you chose to be an introvert. Your DNA may be programmed in that way. And they've done studies of babies, of introverted babies versus extroverted babies. Extroverted babies love those kinds of toys that's put in front of them, and they get all excited with the colors and they rip them and all this kind of stuff. And the introverted baby looks at it and turns around and falls asleep. And the introverted baby is usually called the good baby, and the extroverted baby is the bad baby that likes to be entertained in the middle of the night and wants human contact all the time. So we're born, it's part of it is we're born, and part of it is of choice. In other words, I can choose to a certain degree my behavior, but it's not totally a choice. Okay? I orientate my choices mostly out of what I've inherited from my DNA, my psyche, and my choice of behavior. Now, what's really important, why I'm doing this little introduction to typology is, in this world, meaning the world of created life, right? The best way to know this world is through the senses, the five senses. Okay? So the five senses is what gets me to know about the world. So I know the world through, sight and hearing and touch, and, through these ways I become aware of my environment. Those who are highly sensate, right, notice things and see things. Now, I can walk into a room and then walk out, and if somebody said, what color was that room? I'd say it's a beautiful room. There was a lot of light in the room. It has a inner warmth. I have no idea what color it is. That's why I can meet somebody and know their entire life story, meet them at the mall, and I have no idea what their name is, which is very embarrassing, because it's like, I can think of the last dream this person had, and yet I can't remember their name that I've had for 20 years. And that's pretty humiliating. So in this world, okay, the world of the senses is balanced with another way of getting information, which is intuition. And intuition is also a valid way of getting information, but a very different way. It's not the same. If you turn to the page that has a data gathering in the here and now, sensing characteristics. Mentally, those who are sensates live in the here and now, and they notice the present situation, present opportunity. Using common sense and creating practical solutions is automatic. Okay? Memory recall is rich in the detail of facts and past events. They best improvise from past experience. They learn from the past and they do it better. They like clear and concrete information. And somebody who isn't sensate in their view is fuzzy. I have heard the term airhead. Oh my God, she's such an airhead. Like she hasn't touched the ground in years. Okay, she's probably an intuitive. Okay. Now, what's important in terms of understanding the infinite, the only way to understand the infinite is through intuition. So without a living connection to intuition, you have no way of intuiting. That's why introverted intuitives tend to be more spiritual, not because they're holier than thou, it's because they're connected in a way to the inner world and to the spirit world by nature. So the intuitive characteristics, they mentally live in the future, or planning the future, or visualizing the future. Okay. I have a friend who's a sensate, and I was doing this thing, and he says, "Why do you think about this?" I said, "Don't you ever think of death?" Not a moment. He's too busy living in the now. I mean, he's totally extroverted sensate. It's like, that's a waste of time. It's not like I'd like not to think about it, but being who I am, I lean in that direction. Because I go to the unknown, and to the unknown that is only addressed through intuition. They see patterns and context, but not details. They best improvise through theoretical understanding. They're very comfortable with the ambivalent and the ambiguity. And data, they would think like somebody who's a sensate, oh, they're so selfish, they're always worried about money. Or it's like, they're so literal. Or, on one side the projection is fuzzy, on the other side is materialistic. Now remember, we're supposed to walk with 2 feet. We're supposed to have sensate and intuition. Overdevelopment of one or the other causes problems. Okay? Now, some of you here, especially Father Garrett, knows my buddy Pedro from Miami. He was a former novice of mine, and he's volunteered here, and he's been part of the creation of the contemplative groups and so forth. Wonderful human being, but totally intuitive, okay? Introverted intuitive. So one time when they were novices, of course God always creates this chemistry. The other novice is extroverted sensei, and he is introverted intuitive. You know, like oil and vinegar is like it just didn't match. So it was Christmas time, and they went to the mall. And when they came back from the mall, they were gone shopping. I said to the extrovert, I said, you know, so what was happening there? So he goes into great detail about the tree was in the middle of the mall and Santa Claus was there, and there was a whole, you know, all the details that's not what I was asking for, but I got all the details of like, and the colors were like this, and they had a reindeer, and they, you know, and the other one is looking at him like, I said, Pedro, what did you see? He said, I didn't see any of that. I said, what did you see? Well, I saw families having a good time. I saw, you know, had a feeling of warmth and music, and he had a general sense. He was so disturbed by not seeing that he got in the car and went back to the mall, which was 20 miles away. Went back to the mall because he didn't believe that he missed all of that, and he came back depressed that he had missed it all. But that's what happens with the introverted intuitive. You have a global sense of like, oh, it's a wonderful place. And so, was there Santa Claus? I don't know. You know, did they have real reindeer? I don't think so. You see what I'm saying? The intuitive leaps. And that's why intuition is the gift to understand the infinite. Without intuition, we get bogged down in the material and some of the folks that are on Zoom in particular, but Brother Tom here knows one of our beloved friends. Yeah, I'm quoting you. His name is Brother David, and I live with him. You know, I know he knows that I talk about him in workshops because he's indescribable. He is a complete intuitive, okay? Generous, kind, good. You know when they say, you know, if you live with a saint, you become a saint because, you know, they work on you. So he has no problems in giving the shirt off his back. He's so good. And he volunteers for everything, you know? Even things that he should not volunteer for. So one day before the pandemic, I'm coming back from California, and he volunteers to pick me up in Newark Airport. Now, I was a little cautious, but I said, okay. And he was taking my car, the car that I use. And I was even a little bit more cautious. So, you know, I flew all night on a red eye. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. I am dead tired. I'm dragging my bag out, and I'm waiting to see him. And I see the car. I said, oh my God, thank God he's here. I just jump in the car and go to bed. As I'm watching him, I see him hit a truck. Crash. Okay. And it's like, all of a sudden, I like almost passed out, like, oh no. This is going to be like, how long is this going to take before I can get in the car and get home? And he did it right in front of a policeman. Not only a truck, but in front of the policeman at Newark Airport at like 6:30 in the morning. But he was generous, and he would always volunteer to pick me up. Now, it took me weeks to unravel the insurance, the car, and all this kind of stuff, because what you learn about an intuitive is they will do it, but it's always the shadow, their shadow side is always being here. He's got a foot and a half someplace else, okay? And it's all the goodness of the desire, right? The immortal desires. But the shadow piece of it is how to be here. Like, I do all this kind of work, like I'll prepare all this kind of stuff. I have no anxiety about giving the material. I have anxiety about getting to the retreat house. You know, is it going to be delayed? You know, do I have the phone number of the person who's going to pick me up? You know, am I going to get stranded in Charleston? You know, like really all sensate fears, right? No, I've traveled my whole life, but your shadow is always your shadow. Okay, the vast majority of Americans, I think over 44%, are extroverted sensates. Okay, so the culture tends to be very literal and materialistic and present to the external realities, and part of the shadow is not having that spiritual intuition or that awareness. So one of the things that, if you look on the page that has eternity, Jung, and religion, Jung here mentions a term in Latin where he calls it consensus genitum, which is kind of the worldwide consensus. There's a worldwide consensus across religious histories and across time that human beings have intuited an afterlife. Now, that's not proof that there is an afterlife. But what Jung says is that that's not a theological base, it's that the basis of all great religions in the world is that we need to prepare for this transition. The paradoxical formula is that there's no significance to life unless you see your life as a preparation for transition. And the great living religions ultimately have to deal with this issue of that there must be something more. Now, the famous cave paintings in France, I think it's Lascaux paintings, 17,000 years ago, were all about the afterlife. When I've been to Ireland and go into the oldest structure in Europe, 5,200 years old, it was a burial place in which light would stream into the center of this mound once a year on the winter solstice. So it was this whole relationship between light and darkness, way before Christianity. So these are archetypal human patterns that have always been with us. And Christianity has absorbed some of those mystery religions, and light and darkness, and certainly suffering, death, and resurrection are part of this primary structure of religious knowledge. Now, what Jung says is the head, our minds, our rational minds, are inadequate to deal with this problem because it's not rational. To take life out of death is not a rational response. It doesn't mean that it's irrational, it means it's non-rational. It's a truth, but not relegated to the scientific experiment of putting it under a microscope and understanding it. What has to happen is the eternal is really born more from the heart and the deep psychic levels of revelation. And symbols, they arrive from not a mental ability, because simply trying to think it out doesn't solve the problem. If anything, it leads us into despair if we only try and make sense out of it with our mind. And you see this with a couple of biblical characters, right? You have Nicodemus, when Jesus says, unless you're born again, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does Nicodemus say? How am I going to go back into my mother's womb? A little bit of a lack of imagination. There was only one way to be born, okay? Or Thomas, unless I put my hands into his wounds, I won't believe. It had to be literal. And we realize that, you know, even our understanding of resurrection may not necessarily be literal, but it is real. There's something about the resurrection of new life that was accomplished in that historical moment in which Jesus became the Christ and eternal life was born in a new way. So it comes from the soul. It's a psychological truth. It's not necessarily an external biological truth. And death is the fulfillment of life's meaning. Without death, there is no conclusion or purpose for life. So, and you notice throughout the history of humanity, there's always been this illusion that I can find the fountain of eternal life, you know? We'll go across the world to find the, you know, and the whole issue is you already have it. It's inside of you. You're looking for the fountain of eternal life. You don't have to go 5,000 miles to find it. It is within you. And it says in the gospel, the kingdom of God is within. This eternal dimension already exists within you. So in order to reach a final conclusion, okay, and as Jung says here, and this was Tom Hand, the only way to really know is when you die. I mean, we are only they're presuppositions, but the trust that's necessary is that based upon our intuition, we move in a direction to trust the process, and that we're being led to a place, not just you know, a theoretical experiment. So let's take some time to answer some questions on this issue of eternity before we move towards dreams.
Would you say that the eternal infinite is synonymous with the spiritual?
I'd say it is synonymous with the spirit, the spiritual, religious experience, intuitive knowledge of the eternal, and that's all clustered in that dimension, I think.
The other thing is you really helped me solve a family dynamic. My sisters come here and tell stories, and I accuse them of remembering things that didn't happen.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
I realize I'm more intuitive, they're more sensitive.
Yeah.
So that really
Absolutely. You probably had a felt experience of what happened, but what happened? You missed the whole point. Yeah.
And one other thing is we were talking about how the notion of the eternal helps people. Also, I think the notion of the spiritual helps in healing too. Those
Yes.
who have some sense of the eternal
That's right.
heal better than those who don't.
They do. They do. And there is a greater sense of healing with people who believe that being prayed for will be a healing instrument. Yes.
And speaking of family dynamics, I have 2 children, one extrovert, one introvert. I'm an introvert. And I didn't realize this until my children were grown. The younger one was the extrovert, and he'd come to visit me. And I'm like, how did I raise this kid? He was like a flaming introvert, but yet he had a lot of intuitiveness going on as well.
Right.
But
right.
it is interesting to know that we are sort of born with this.
Absolutely.
And then
we're
when
born
we
with it.
realize that we can harness it, you know, as an introvert, it's not that I don't like people. I mean,
No.
it's that I need to be by myself to regenerate myself.
That's right. So
Whereas
introversion
my
is not about shyness.
Yeah, and my extroverted son, he, you know,
Needs people.
he needs to go to a concert.
That's
you know?
right. To get energized.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just-
The thought of going to a concert makes me exhausted.
Oh yeah, the thought of going to Walmart makes me
Yeah. But you know what's funny is like typical for an introvert is like I'm really excited about going on a trip. The closer I go going to the trip, the more I don't want to go anymore. It's the strangest thing. It's like you plan this trip and it's like you spend all the money. It's like, oh, this is so exciting. Oh, I wish I didn't have to go. Like, what's wrong with you? You know, I say to myself, what's wrong with it? Because I know the energy that will be demanded from me to be able to engage all of that. So I begin to feel the exhaustion before the actual exhaustion.
But you still go.
I still go, yeah. Yeah, I don't hide, but it's like, also, you know, parental stuff, we were talking about this earlier, about, you know, my mother was an extrovert, and I used, there's one of the workshops I did is on introversion, and it's like, she thought I was chronically depressed, and I was running away from her most of the time because she wanted me to do things I didn't want to do, like go out and play with your friends. I just came in, you know, why are you reading that book? Because I enjoy it. You know, it's like she had no sense of, because in her worldview, this would have been depressing. So a lot of times what we get from our parents is their interpretation of your wholeness without knowing necessarily your DNA about what really is going to create wholeness for you. And that can cause a lot of, you know, judgments and so forth. Yes.
Is there, you know, these are older concepts, or what about trauma? And the body keeps the score, and this is sort of like came later, and is
Yes.
that
Yes.
in there?
Yes. Yes. I've done some work in this. Donald Kalschit, who is a Jungian, has written 2 books, The Inner World of Trauma and then The Soul and Trauma, both excellent books. What he says, what I took out of that is, what I've noticed is there's introversion and there's traumatic introversion. That is, the trauma threw the person into a deeper interiority in order to survive. So they're not just naturally introverted, there's a different kind of introversion that is protective from being re-traumatized. So I think there are ways in which events in our life take our natural things and then readjust them or redo them, you know, in a way. So to recognize that. Okay, since we have no one on the other side, let's take a quick break. Let's take a few minute break. I need to go to the bathroom and get something to drink, and then we can continue again. Let's